There's an old story about an eagle's egg which managed to roll into the nest of a prairie chicken. The eaglet hatched with a brood of chicks and grew up with them. All his life, the eagle, thinking he was a prairie chicken, did what prairie chickens did. He scratched in the dirt for seeds and insects to eat. He clucked and cackled, and he flew, flapping his wings as hard as possible. But he flew no more than a few feet off the ground, flying just as prairie chickens flew. Years later, the eagle looked up and saw a magnificent bird flying far above him. It hung in the air as it soared on the powerful wind currents high above the earth, and this mysterious bird seemed to float in the air as it hardly moved its wings. "What a beautiful bird," said the eagle to his prairie chicken neighbor. "What is it?" "That's an eagle, the chief of the birds," his neighbor clucked. "But don't give it a second thought. You can never be like him." So the poor eagle never gave it a second thought and went back to pecking in the dust, thinking he was nothing more than a prairie chicken. Like the eagle, the wealthy man in Mark's gospel saw a spark of hope in Jesus that would have allowed him to spiritually soar. And he recognized that even though he had a lot of possessions, in reality he had nothing. Realizing he was lacking something, the man approached Jesus and knelt before him. Unlike the Pharisees, his question was not designed to trap Jesus. And unlike Nicodemus, who met secretly with Jesus at midnight, the young man was bold, desperate for answers, and desperate to fill the void in his life when he approached Jesus on the public road in broad daylight. The words the man spoke are better heard like this: "Jesus, what am I lacking so I can find life and be truly alive?" And Jesus responded by naming just a few of the 10 Commandments. As Jesus named the list, I imagine the man grew encouraged because he strictly obeyed every rule Jesus named. And when Jesus finished, the man exclaimed, "Teacher, I've kept all these since youth." However, Jesus recognized that even though the man adhered strictly to the laws, an obstacle remained in the man's life. An obstacle that he held so strongly onto it prevented him from committing himself fully to God. And it prevented him from unlocking his full potential so he could spiritually soar. When Jesus told the man to give his possessions to the poor, Jesus revealed that the man actually violated one of the commandments that weren't named, the commandment that prohibited worshiping idols. The man was exposed. The man relied on his possessions to provide him with status, power, and security, and thus he obsessed about them and his ability to accumulate stuff. One commentator observed that the man's wealth had shortchanged his ability to follow Jesus because he couldn't obey the greatest of the commandments, even if he obeyed the others. The man's problem was not that he had wealth or possessions. Rather, his problem was that his possessions possessed him. The man believed his possessions defined his identity. And the man was so possessed by his pursuit to accumulate stuff and preserve it, he wasn't able to see the greater picture of greatness that God had in store for him. And even when Jesus revealed an exit for the man to be freed from his possessions and freed from his anxiety about accumulating and preserving the stuff he had, sadly, like the eagle in the story, the man closed his mind and heart to what Jesus offered. And he remained consumed by consumerism instead of receiving freedom. The man never discovered how to spiritually soar because he clung to an idol. He chose to keep pecking in the dirt, gathering possessions that ultimately would serve no purpose, for his idols could not give life, nor would they offer true nourishment, either spiritually or physically. The frightening part of the story, though, is that though we may not be wealthy like the rich man, there are possibly idols in our hearts that prevent us from soaring spiritually with God. Perhaps there are things we hoard or view as necessary for our security and well-being. And though we may not worship these things in the traditional sense, at the same time we won't let go of them, or we refuse to share them with those who might benefit from them. Like the rich man hoarding our possessions, We turn our focus away from God to pursue additional possessions. And no matter how much stuff we accumulate, we're never satisfied. Author Dennis Potter writes, "This pursuit of stuff is one of the biggest beguilers of the Christian mind because we are consumed by consumerism and its shabby little gospel of greed and gain." The so-called gospel of consumerism is also known as the prosperity gospel, which teaches that the accumulation of stuff is evidence that God loves us. However, believing the gospel of prosperity, we must follow this line of thinking to its horrible conclusion, that if things are taken away, stolen, or destroyed, then it was God who took our riches away. In addition, we can only conclude then that since God took them away, then God is either not pleased with us in our actions, or worse, we must conclude that God hates us. Turning briefly to the Old Testament book of Job, prior to our reading of Job's sad monologue, Job's friends believed in this type of positive confession theology, or name it and claim it prosperity message. They believed in a possession reward system in which God rewarded the righteous with wealth and punished the unrighteous with poverty. In the story of Job, when Job and his wife experienced a terrible tragedy, his so-called friends blamed his misfortune and loss of his possessions on him, stating he must have offended God. Thus, Job's friends conveniently ignored the proverb claim that it rains on both the just and the unjust. In our reading from Job, we heard Job's negative response because he adopted their line of thinking, and he demanded that God appear before him so he could argue, perhaps even wrestle with God, because he was convinced that he was a righteous man and he deserved stuff, even wealth. This was the mindset of the rich man in Mark's gospel too. He believed he was rich because God blessed him, and he believed God blessed him because he was righteous. But even with the blessings, or what he called blessings, he recognized something was lacking in his life. He realized that the goal in life couldn't just be about gathering possessions and then hoarding them. And Jesus responded as much. But Jesus' response, which called him to the freedom in God that would be found in divestment of material goods and through discipleship, was too costly for the man. The man's vision was clouded because the stuff said, "Ignore Jesus," who soared overhead and offered hope. And the man settled for less than what Jesus offered. To be clear about this scene, Jesus was not anti-wealth nor anti-accumulating things that are necessary for our lives, but Jesus was concerned about how tightly we hold on to these possessions, and he was worried that we make them our master. He warned that we shouldn't spend our energy and time chasing after riches and gain if we're sacrificing our time with God. And he was concerned about how possessive we become of our possessions, treating them as though they were priceless and irreplaceable. Jesus was concerned that these items threaten our relationship with God, especially when material things that can be eaten by rust or moths become more valuable than life. Jesus repeatedly said that if a thief threatens to take your stuff, let him have it. And I don't mean in the Bruce Willis action movie kind of way, let them have it. I mean in the, if they come to take your stuff, help them pack it into their car. And then as they leave, give them your underwear too. That's in Luke 6. No item, no treasure, no material possession is worth forfeiting your soul over. Because stuff is just stuff. But our lives and the lives of others are holy, sealed with God's image. Viewing stuff as stuff and not as an idol to be worshipped or gained, we find wonderful freedom in Jesus because we won't constantly worry that someone is going to take it or that we'll lose it. In addition, with a different point of view regarding stuff, we won't be worried about sharing it because abundance flows when things are shared and received. For example, in one of Jesus' parables, he said there were 3 men who received a certain amount of money. 2 of the men invested it in the community, so it blessed others, and in return, they earned double what they began with. But a third man took what he received, and he buried it in the ground so that no one would take it, nor be able to use it. But he had the satisfaction of knowing he had it. Two of the men at the end of the parable received praise, but the third one, like the rich man in our story, left as he began, loved by Jesus, but spiritually poor. Though this gospel account ends sadly, I see a bit of hope. Hope for the man and hope for us. Even though the man walked away after Jesus told him to sell, give it away, and follow him, he didn't walk away angry or cursing or even demanding a second opinion. Rather, the man left grieving, which suggests he understood what he had to do. And though it would not be easy, he had to make a decision to give his idols away. Imagining a happier ending for this man, and perhaps for us, we are asked to consider, what items exist in your life that come between you and God and your ability to follow? And what is it that God and God alone can help you give away so that nothing comes between you and God, thus freeing you to spiritually soar to amazing heights with God, where we are freed from worry and concern of clinging onto material things?